Kevin?
Thanks, Allie. All right. Today I'm going to be talking about 5 things to remember after signing a lease. These are just 5 things that I've, in my practice so far, working in eviction court, I think I've identified as, 5 things that will help tenants throughout their process, whether negotiating with landlords before an eviction case or while dealing with an active eviction case. So the first thing that I wanted to list was always remember to communicate with your landlords in writing. It's often the case that disputes with landlords and tenants will come up, and communicating with your landlord in writing will create a record of what was said, when it was said, and who said it, and that can just be invaluable in the future when disputes do arise, because oftentimes the disputes that do come up during in the landlord-tenant relationship are about promises that were made, and then somebody alleging that another party didn't keep that promise, and so having that written information is really, really valuable. If oftentimes communications take place over the phone or in person, and when that happens, I think you can always just follow up with your landlord and send them a message and say, hey, it was nice to see you today. Here's what we talked about. Thanks again for your time. Just to again have that in writing as to what was said. And then, I think one thing to also remember about trying to memorialize those conversations is that it is also a two-way street. So, anything that you, say in your conversation with your landlord and put down in that in an email to them is something that's also going to be kept by them and could be used against you in the future. If a dispute arises. Always remember that it's a two-way street. The next slide, it's landlords are not obligated to offer to renew your lease when it expires, and so more often than not, leases are for 12 months, and when the time comes towards the end of your lease, your landlord isn't required to say, hey, here's your lease, please, sign again. If they want, for any non-discriminatory reason or, without even offering a reason, the landlord can say, we're not going to renew your lease and you need to find somewhere else to live. And oftentimes that's a surprise to a lot of tenants because, they feel like they haven't had any rule warnings or anything, saying they violated rules from the landlord, but as long as they do provide the proper notice, they can say we're not going to renew your lease. And if a landlord does choose to not renew your lease, they are required to notify a tenant, and the length of time that they're required to give you depends on where you live. So, for example, in Chicago, we'll start here in Evanston. In Evanston, if the agreement is month to month or just any other agreement, the landlord is only required to give 30 days notice, written notice, saying that they're not going to renew your lease, and then you have to find elsewhere to live. In Chicago, for leases that are 0 to 6 months, so anything 6 months or less, they also have to provide that same 30 days notice. For leases that are between 6 months to 3 years in Chicago, they have to provide 60 days notice. And then in Chicago, for leases that have been active for greater than 3 years, they have to provide 120 days notice. But either way, they do have to provide some sort of notice, but they can still, terminate a lease at their discretion. The next slide is just always remember that both landlords and tenants have the right to terminate their lease early. For tenants, it is in much more limited circumstances, but we'll start with landlords. So a landlord can terminate terminate a tenant's lease most often than not for non-payment of rent or for any other lease violation. And again, it depending on where you live and what a landlord is evicting a tenant for, they still have to provide some sort of notice about the lease violation and give a tenant an opportunity to correct that violation. So in Evanston, if a tenant is being evicted for non-payment of rent, the landlord has to serve them with a 10-day notice and say essentially how much is owed in rent, and then give them an opportunity within that 10 days to pay the full amount. And then if they aren't able to do that, then the landlord can proceed with an eviction lawsuit. There is an exception in Evanston where if it is an owner-occupied home, basically, if the landlord is living in a building with someone with two other units or less that they're renting out to other people, then they are only required to give 48 hours notice to the tenant. And then in Chicago, that notice period is 5 days, where they can say you're behind on rent, you have 5 days to pay it back. And then in the greater Cook County area, under the Cook County Residential Landlord Tenant Ordinance, tenants are actually afforded a one-time right to pay and stay, where they are basically can pay back. They always have one opportunity to pay back whatever is overdue, and then they would have the right to stay in that apartment. And then for notice for lease violations other than non-payment of rents, in Evanston, a landlord is required to give a tenant 30 days notice, and then they will have an opportunity to cure that violation within that period as long as the violation can be cured. In Chicago, that notice period is only 10 days. And then in the greater Cook County area, that is also a 10-day notice period. However, if in the greater Cook County area, if a landlord does not file an eviction within 30 days of that 10-day notice period expiring, then that notice will technically expire and they wouldn't be able to proceed with an eviction lawsuit. And then tenants also have the right to terminate a lease, and this is most often for a landlord's material non-compliance with the lease, which can include having uninhabitable living conditions, and this can be done by providing notice to the landlord, and written notice to the landlord of the issues with the apartment or how they're not in compliance with the lease, and then of their intent to move out of the apartment within a certain period. And in Evanston, that time period is 14 days. So you give the landlord 14 days notice. If they don't correct the issue within 14 days, then the tenant will have 30 days thereafter to move out. In Chicago, it's also in Chicago, it's 14 days and then 30 days to move out. In Cook County, it is also 14 days and 30 days to move out. And then in Evanston, you actually just provide written notice to the landlord that you're going to move out within a certain time after a 30-day period. But basically the point is, you just have to notify your landlord of the issues with the apartments that you're going to move out within the specific time period for the area that you live in, and then if the landlord doesn't correct the issue, then you're able to leave. And then there's also situations where the landlords fail to provide essential services, and there's also other threats to a tenant's health and safety. So this more often than not is when your apartment is without heat, electricity, gas, plumbing, water, and things like that. And in Evanston, you have to provide similar written notice to the landlord and stating when you will move out, but that period is only 7 days for these essential services. And in Chicago, the period is much shorter. It's a 72-hour period, So the landlord only has 72 hours to correct the issue, and then a tenant can terminate their lease. And then it is also a 72-hour period in the greater Cook County area. And so the second category of essential services and threats to health and safety, as you can see, are considered much more serious because again, nobody should be without heat or water, or those essential services that are listed. And the next slide is only a sheriff of the county where you live can basically force you to move out an apartment. And so this means a landlord cannot remove a tenant's personal property from an apartment. They can't change the locks or do anything else to kind of stop a tenant's access to the premises. And this is a lot of times you run into situations where a landlord threatens to change the locks on a tenant, or start taking away, blocking their storage unit, or doing things like that. And these are situations where that's definitely not okay, not acceptable. And only the sheriff should be doing these things, and the sheriff is only able to enforce an eviction order. The sheriff's only able to take these actions after an eviction order has been entered by a judge, and they are acting to enforce that order. And then for the last slide, it's always important for tenants to remember that even if you're being evicted for non-compliance with the lease or non-payment of rents, a tenant will always remain liable for the amounts of rents that continues to accrue each month for as long as they stay in an apartment. And so even if you're being evicted for being late on rent, and you offer to pay the landlord what's overdue, if it's after the notice period has expired, then the landlord can say, no, I'm not going to take your money now, and then later on down the road, when the eviction trial's over after 3 months, you'll still be responsible for all the rent that is accrued until eventually vacating the premises. And then here's a short review of the 5 points, but I don't need to go through those again. And then contact information for us at the Moran Center. Thank you.